Hello. Hello, everyone. Jim, we just saw you enter. We're going to give people a couple of minutes to trickle in. It's just a couple of minutes before the hour. Um, but we were just chatting about net inclusion, and I'm sure a lot of people in here have. If you want to throw something in the chat about your favorite experience at net inclusion or your favorite panel that you were a part of, we would love to hear about that. Or if you're sick of talking about net inclusion, we'd love to hear about just what you guys are up to this week. Maybe some opinions about stuff that you learned or things that you're working on, excited to share. We're always happy to highlight others. I will say that one of the things I was impressed at net inclusion was all the digital navigators that they came up and shared, and that huge like photo that they got to take together, I thought was really special. And glad that they got the encouragement, the recognition that they definitely deserve. So that was a cool for me, I think.
Hi,
Hello.
Julia.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I was just saying hi to Julia. Hi, Julia. Hi, Jim. Hi. Always nice to have friends on a call. I went to the tribal broadband boot camp the day before. I know Ryan, you were also there. I thought it was great. They hadn't announced a whole lot beforehand about it, so it was a welcome surprise for how fired up and how packed that room was.
Yeah, that's great that they kind of gave us a special moment for that topic, because there were so many panels at net inclusion.
Yeah.
And I always felt like the only downfall was that I missed something else that I really wanted to go to, because I was conflicted on what I really wanted to sit in on, and wish that there was maybe more time or duplicates of things. But I think that's just a compliment to all of the great panels that they had and all the great speakers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we will get ourselves started, because we want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we are 1 minute past the hour. So thank you all so much for being here today. This is our first series in our first session in the series of Broadband Book Club. And we thought it would be a cool way for us to share insightful topics and things with folks, and provide a space for those to share what they're working on, share the research that they're doing, and for authors to provide insights and potentially expand their research in that way. So it's something that we're hoping to do on a quarterly basis. So please check out our look for our new information and other authors that we're going to be sharing. But we are so excited to have Christopher Ali here with us today, who wrote an incredible book, Fresh Broadband, the Politics of Rural Connectivity. And we're excited to hear from him and all of the research that he did. Yes, we'll shout out to the book, and we will be leaving, adding in the chat, a link to the ability to purchase this amazing book if you had not had the chance to do that yet. So we are so excited for that. Before I turn it over to Chris, I want to just kind of lay a little bit of a groundwork on our Broadband Book Club. We really hope that it is a collaborative feel, that it kind of feels like we're all, we're virtual in this world, but we want to feel like it's a tight-knit group that we can share experiences, like share questions, share ideas, and have it be a place where we really focus on collaboration and encourage you all to do that. So if there are things you would like to jump in the chat and say, please feel free to unmute yourself if you feel the time is right. If you prefer to raise your hand, we'll be happy to do that way as well. But we really want to encourage a collaborative feel and have a conversational approach to not a very classic standard webinar. So we're excited to have that, and to have all of you here with us today, and to kick off our first session of the series with Christopher Ali. So I will turn it over to him and allow him to kind of give us a little synopsis of the book, and kind of his passion for doing this work. And we're excited to hear from that. And Ryan Johnson, who is our senior policy counsel, will also be co-hosting with us today. And so thank you all for being here, and thank you, Chris.
Well, thank you so much, Stacy, and thank you so much, Next Century Cities, for inviting me to be the first author in what I have no doubt will be an incredibly successful broadband book club. I know I am super pumped to attend all the other ones, so it really is quite an honor. And thank you to everyone um, who is taking time out of their Wednesday afternoon to come talk about Farm Fresh Broadband. So a little bit of a background about the book. The book came out in September of 2021. Interesting kind of auspicious moment given that the Infrastructure Act was around the same time. So it was kind of a fortuitous moment where I had an opportunity to see broadband policy develop in real time. And the book, I like to describe the book as stories of successes and stories of failures. Failure being the primary object of the book was an analysis of federal policy towards rural digital infrastructure, particularly deployment of high-speed broadband in rural and remote areas. That's where the failure comes in. It involved about 10 to 20,000 pages of reading and of policy documents over the last 10 years from the FCC, from USDA and TIA, Congress, and the White House around what exactly have we been doing to fulfill the promise of universal service in our rural and remote areas. Failure. One of the major failures, of course, and this happens in chapter 2, is how we've allocated so much money, particularly Connect America Fund money. Those of you on this call need no introduction to Connect America. But of course, one of the original things that we did was we spent $1 billion a year from the Universal Service Fund, giving that to the 10 largest telecommunications companies. And in return, asked for nothing more than a broadband network deployed at 10.1, right? Back in 2015 when the definition was 25.3. So we allowed the digital divide to persist, so much so now that, we have just injected $65 billion into this ecosystem. So that's these kind of stories of a failure, right? The failure of federal policy to uphold the values of universal service for rural and remote communities. I spend the first chapter actually connecting the dots between rural electrification and rural broadband, looking at how did we actually get it right in the 1930s and what lessons were we not following? And again, I point to the position of large incumbents. One of the things that we did with the Rural Electrification Administration in 1936 was largely bypassed what was then called big power, and instead incentivized the creation of local electric cooperatives. And of course, we know local electric cooperatives today are some of the major providers of broadband. So isn't that fortuitous? And so that's one of the major takeaways, is because we often say, in fact, even President Biden said when he announced what was then called the American Jobs Plan Act, what would then become the Infrastructure Act, broadband is the next electricity, right? I'm sure we've all heard kind of an iteration of that phrase, but the book really investigates, okay, what does it actually mean? What does it actually mean to compare broadband with electricity in terms of how we made it happen? And of course, one of the things that we did is that we didn't limit what electricity was by voltage, right? We didn't say, okay, you get enough electricity for 2 light bulbs, right? You don't get the 10, you get the 10.1 version of this. Instead, we said, no, electrification for all. And this leads me to another one of the major points in the book, which is something that I call the politics of good enough, right? That so much of policy, telecommunications policy, with an aim towards service in rural and remote areas has been defined by a politics of good enough. That whatever you can get is good enough, right? Geosynchronous satellite is good enough. 10.1 is good enough. Dial-up is good enough. Just so long as you have something, right? It is good enough. And this really, I think hopefully complicates the narrative of what exactly rural communities want and deserve, right? We've often replicated kind of a very pejorative kind of understanding of rural communities, that they don't need connectivity, they don't need this, they don't need that, right? It's good enough, whatever they can get, right? And how awful and discriminatory has this policy apparatus been in this politics of good enough? And to be honest, I see a lot of that politics of good enough rearing its head repeatedly in kind of today's policy ecosystem. So this brings me to stories of success. And the way that I bring up stories of success is by highlighting community accomplishments, highlighting electric cooperatives, highlighting public-private partnerships, highlighting what's going on broadband to the farm. So chapter 4, for instance, is a case study of Rock County, Minnesota. Rock County, Minnesota is located in the west pocket of the state, border South Dakota. And thanks to a public-private partnership and a grant from the state of Minnesota, this is of course pre-COVID, right? So this is like old school real state money. Rock County now has 100, or then had 100% fiber to the home pass by in 2019. I mean, that is gangbusters, right? And so what conditions happened that would allow Rock County to be the most connected county in the state of Minnesota, and which we all know is already ahead of the game when it comes to broadband. So I kind of highlight those. And of course, we all know that like rural infrastructure is not a cookie cutter solution, but what are some of the things that we can take away from Rock County, right? Things like the importance of digital champions, things like the importance of supportive boards of supervisors, things like understanding your community needs and usage, right? They had options for fixed wireless, they had options for something else, but they said, no, our community needs fiber. Right. So they were empowered to make the right decisions for their community. So how those are lessons that we can take. And of course, I know those are lessons that Next Century Cities lives by, right? Which is empowering our communities to make the right digital choices for themselves. So I think that the grassroots stories really hopefully mitigate the amount of criticism and critique I offer of broadband policy. Now, I should say that one of the things that I also did, I started writing this book in 2018. And halfway through writing this book, I realized that maybe not everyone would find 300 pages of policy analysis as captivating as I will. Maybe it won't sell very well. Not that I'm particularly worried about the sales, though the sales are lovely. I needed to humanize this. I needed to humanize broadband policy and technology. And so one summer, a couple weeks, two and a half weeks in summer of 2018, my hound dog Tuna and I, cat smiling, cats met Tuna. We did what we called the rural broadband road trip, and we drove around the Midwest talking to folks about broadband, talking to boards of supervisors, going into restaurants, taking walks, going to supermarkets, just the Tuna and I, and to humanize this process that we all talk about. And that is actually something that has become near and dear to my heart. The need to make sure, and this is where Farm Fresh Broadband ends, so spoiler alert, which is that at the end of the day, broadband is not about technology or politics or policy or money or companies. It's about people, right? So how do we make sure that when we're thinking about the crafting of broadband policy, we are doing a people first, local first, community first articulation of these policies and values? And that's actually what's going to bring me on to my next major project. So in a nutshell, that is Farm Fresh Broadband. And now look, you don't have to buy the book.
I'm sure everyone who hasn't definitely will, because that synopsis was incredible. Thank you. And I definitely say that I appreciate the historical context because it gives us a chance to look at the patterns and, like you said, the failures and the things that maybe places we miss that we shouldn't have based on, historical context of electricity in this country. And absolutely appreciated your person-centered approach to this work. At Next Century Cities, we absolutely feel the same way. We believe in the empowerment of local communities, of people, and lifting stories and having storytelling being a key component of policy change. And so I really appreciated that. We definitely have some questions for you that we're excited to get to, but I wanted just to remind the audience that we really wanted this to be a collaborative feel and encourage you to ask your own questions. If you feel that it's appropriate at time for you to come off of mute, we really encourage you to do that. Drop it in the chat, any of those options. We really want to feel that we're all a part of this book club.
Yes.
So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there before we get started. But generally, a lot of broadband policy looks like an urban versus rural divide in terms of access versus adoption, and it's framed that way. But the rural divide has many nuances, many more nuances than this. Could you maybe give us a little bit of an overview of how you touch on those nuances specifically in your book?
Right. No, thank you, Stacey. And it's a great question because it allows me to actually back up and say that, some of the criticism the book has received is that it is a rural-centric book. And I'll just say, hopefully this goes without saying, but the book does not assume there are no other digital divides that exist. It focuses on rural infrastructure. But of course, we know that the digital divide is intersectional. It is intersectional by geography, by income, by race, by indigenous status, right? So well aware of what is going on. Rural comes with its own kind of unique challenges, particularly in what political economists might call like a market failure, right? That the people in rural communities live too far apart, and there is not enough of them for private investment, and hence the reason we have all of these subsidies to incentivize private provision. So that's one of the kind of, I think, interesting dynamics is just literal consumer base when it comes to that. The other thing we need to think about for rural, and I make is what exactly is rural? A couple of years ago, the USDA was ordered by Congress. A couple of years ago, it was 2008. USDA was ordered by Congress to provide a report on all the definitions of rural. And there is something like 35 different definitions just within USDA of what exactly rural is. And in fact, the FCC itself has a bonkers array of rural. It seems that like every new docket, there's a new definition of rural. Rural healthcare docket is one. The TV whites, or I think it's TV whites, one of the TV dockets actually just described rural as any place where there is open television spectrum. It would be therefore a rural community. Like it's kind of bonkers. USDA has different thresholds, right? For instance, the Telecommunications Loan and Grant Program has a threshold of 5,000 people, right? Others is 25,000 people. The census is 50,000 people, not adjacent to another 50,000 or over location. I use the census definition, but I think the other thing we need to understand is rural is also subjective, right? Rural is also a feeling, a state of being, right? But one of the things I do make sure to note is that rural is not exclusively about agriculture, and rural is not exclusively white, right? And this is one of the really important dynamics that we need to be thinking about. I think often in contemporary politics, we reduce the rural to being only about white folks, and we know this is not the case. Rural communities are dynamic and intersectional and multicultural, and I hope the book captures that. At least in spirit. So I think defining our terms is really important, especially when the word rural is literally in the cover. And that I spent a whole chapter really defining that term for my readers, and eventually settled on, okay, I'm thinking about rural in terms of a community of less than 50,000 people. Using again the census definition. The other thing, though, as much as I just said rural is not equating with farm, I was particularly interested in agriculture with this book. In fact, the genesis of the book was actually to write a book about farming and farm communication. And then I realized that farm communication is actually part of this much larger political issue known as rural broadband. But still, farming communities kind of sang to me. And so when Tuna and I did our road trip, we were particularly interested in hanging out in rural agricultural communities of the Midwest. I'm talking here really about row crops, right? I'm talking about soybeans, I'm talking about corn, I'm talking about wheat, right? Not talking really about livestock, although we did visit a fascinating hog farm. And so one of the things that we can use to complicate rural in terms of broadband is the fact that we do not map broadband to the farm, right? There's, massive holes in the broadband map around like huge amounts of agriculture. And what are the agricultural needs, or what are the technological needs of agriculture, right? I mean, it sounds glib, but you can't hook up a John Deere tractor to a fiber optic cable. You just can't, right? So it demands innovative wireless solutions. So it also, in doing so, it also nuances the kind of fiber focused debate. I know, yes, we love fiber and fiber is important. Fiber is not going to work for a 1,000-acre soybean farm. It's not going to work, right? So we need to keep experimenting with kind of these different types of modalities. So the ag side of rural is an interesting dynamic. The population and density side of rural is an interesting dynamic. And then, of course, the very definition of rural is an interesting dynamic.
And I want to hone in on something that you just mentioned about it being also kind of state of mind too, because like there are the rural communities are so much more than just that there are like 100-acre farms, and it's the fact that like you will have your neighbors come over and say, hey, I don't have internet, I need your help with this, can you look this up for me? Like we used when I grew up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I learned German to be able to talk to my Amish neighbors, and they would come to our house and be like, hey, we need to know like what the weather's going to look like tomorrow, because they couldn't know. And so like having that like sense of not just connectivity from you to the internet, but from person to person, and building that network in and of itself is something that I think is that we don't talk about in the policy space that you hit on so well in your book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Ryan. And, another interesting story that didn't make it into the book, because it was actually a project that I worked on while writing Farm Fresh Broadband, is that a colleague, Nicholas Matthews, and I looked at a broadband and news desert in Virginia. This was Surrey County, Virginia, and this was during the pandemic. And at the time, it had 3% connectivity. That's it. So our questions was, what is life like for these residents in a rural, unconnected, and unnewsed community? And a couple of things we found which were really amazing. One, Ryan, just to piggyback off you're saying, the Dollar General became the information hub of the community, right? People would gather there as kind of what Ray Oldenburg would call a great good place. Became this hub of information exchanging. The other thing we learned is just like how much harder life is, right? In terms of waiting for connectivity, trying to get information, and then the emotional labor, the worry around the future, particularly for young people. One of the most heartbreaking stories we learned from this study, and I'm sorry, this is not exactly about Farm Fresh, but it is about rural, is that there was a family there who had satellite, and with their plan, the data cap reset at midnight, and so they would wake up, they would kind of take this nap and then wake up at midnight to do all of their digital work between midnight and 4 a.m. And they called themselves a second shift family. And that really struck home. This is a family with high school kids. Everyone would wake up at midnight to do their work. This, I mean, I think as a young people would say, it lives like rent free in my head. Like I think about that second shift family so much, and it is so much of what motivates the type of work that I do to make sure that we make life better for those second shift families.
Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
Hey, Chris, good to see
Hey, Jim.
you. Why don't you talk a little bit, because I thought what was really interesting in the Surrey County, Virginia analysis that you and Ryan, you and Nick did, was this whole concept of waiting and temporal domination, which you might see in certain communities that maybe leadership just doesn't embrace the broadband equals electricity and the importance of broadband. Maybe talking about that, I think that was very interesting.
Sure thing. Yeah, thank you, Jim. One of the things that we did find is that life is harder, and life is also defined by waiting in these unconnected communities, either waiting for an internet connection, or waiting because you've got a crappy internet connection and you're literally waiting for it to buffer, right? So you are paying in time just waiting, and which also can breed a lot of anxiety. A lot of folks would say something like, I'll believe it when I see it, right? But the life does just waiting for information, waiting for connectivity, or waiting for buffering. So the kind of the state of waiting is how rural communities are paying for this. Which we just can't have. And going back to Jim's point about county leaders, I mean, like I said about Rock County, to bring it back to the book, I mean, it is absolutely essential. Counties play a tremendous role in broadband infrastructure deployment. I often think that they're kind of like the unspoken kind of gatekeepers of a lot of this. So we need to make sure that our counties are on board. Our county boards of supervisors are on board. And sometimes that takes a lot of time, but just a lot of conversations. If there is hesitancy around, Rock County didn't have that hesitancy, but I certainly worked with counties and worked with boards of supervisors where we just need to sit down in a room and let's just talk this out about about reminding folks that the internet is not a luxury and what it can bring to communities. So counties and county boards of supervisors are just, I mean, to me, in a lot of rural communities, they're very end all and be all of connectivity.
Absolutely. So I guess because I want to ask one, a really policy heavy question, and two, a really history heavy question.
Okay.
Because you hit on the Rural Electrification Act, which, back in 1936 when that was passed, took what, like 11 years to go from very little to basically almost having the entire country wired. But the Comms Act of 1934 was passed 2 years before that, and here we are 90 years later, still trying to implement literally the first paragraph of that act. What's the difference? Why is there such a like monumental gap between people being able to say, oh yeah, no, we can wire the country, but we can't allow folks across the state to talk to each other? Like,
Right. I mean, there's a technological difference, which is less
fair.
interesting, and there's a political difference. Technological, it is a lot easier to transmit electricity than it is to transmit information or voice, right? Like you can do it with chicken wires, which actually literally happened in a lot of rural communities, right? But I think the bigger thing is who was empowered. What the 1936 Rural Electrification Act did is empowered local communities. It specifically sought them out, and it created through these very generous loans the creation of rural electric cooperatives. And so, kind of like I said before, big power was not at all interested in serving these communities. In fact, they even built things called spite lines, where they would, once they found out a rural electric cooperative was going to be designed, they went and cherry picked the most profitable areas, and they were called spite lines. Right. So one of the things that the REA did, and the kind of the originators of the REA did, was bypass big power and go directly to the rural communities. And I think that is something that we missed, right? Particularly with the early days of broadband funding, through the Connect America Fund, we went directly to the big providers. The second thing, though, is that the other thing the REA did, and it came with a double-edged sword, because yes, they were also trying to sell things, is they sent people to these rural communities. It was called the REA Circus, and it was to work with people about what electricity could do for you, right? It's like the original digital navigators. It's the original electricity navigators, right? And yes, they were trying to sell fridges, yes, but they also did a tremendous amount of good, meeting people where they are. And that's something that I'm finding that federal policy is not doing right now, is that we are not meeting our communities where they are. We're assuming they're in particular areas, or knowledge levels, income brackets, right? So, but we're not in communities. So this kind of, well, it's actually both. Both of these solutions have a community first solution to them, right? That is what I really think we're missing now, because these incumbents, what I call in the book the largest and loudest, kind of just end up gobbling up all of this. Because the other thing is, I think the other thing we all know, it is really, really hard to apply for federal money. In fact, someone in my book told me that something like the hardest thing they've ever done in their work is apply for a USDA loan. I had folks tell me that they gave back money because they can't handle the reporting. That is not a community first position. That is you're a giant company. You got a truck ton of lawyers. Yes, you can handle these reporting criteria and these application criteria. Communities can't. Local ISPs with 1 or 2 people can't do that, right? So that's not a community first vision for broadband, universal broadband, and affordable broadband. So my big thing is that we completely bypass communities, which is something that we cherished in the 1930s and valued through the REA and what was then called the REA Circus. And I'll say, Ryan, to your point, you said, yeah, it took 11 years for us to electrify the country. It was so successful that Congress ended up passing called the Rural Telephony Act in 1949, which encouraged USDA to do the exact same thing for telephone, because there was a massive drop off in rural telephone after the Great Depression. USDA did the exact same thing. They went local. And that's how we did it. So if we're going to say broadband is the next electricity, which I believe it is, let's follow the path that worked. Let's follow the model that worked for us when we were worried about rural electricity. I mean, I know this is my soapbox, right? But that's the argument of the book fundamentally, is this local first solution.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like a trickle down approach to trying to get all of those communities met instead of going straight to them, like you said. Robin, thank you so much for your hand. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
I'm wondering, I'm wondering, were there any pattern to who the effective advocates were? Were they the official state broadband person, or the local development person, the mayor, the farmer who just really was outraged? Any patterns?
Right. I mean, farmers absolutely were huge drivers, right? This was a time in which, rural was much more synonymous with agriculture than it is today. So farmers were huge drivers of this. In fact, farmers were establishing their own kind of DIY electrical grids, again, using chicken wire to transmit electricity. They were hooking up generators. I mean, farmers are incredibly innovative when it comes to, doing things for themselves when they need it. And they did the same thing for telephone, actually. Telephone cooperatives, in fact, predate electric cooperatives. But the other interesting thing, so you got farmers on one side, but this was, I mean, FDR ran on rural electrification, right? When he was governor of New York, this became a major component for him. And in fact, even there were folks even contemplating public energy, like we have back in the Great White North of Canada. So there was kind of this two-sided approach, this very grassroots farmers-based approach saying, we need this, and some very sympathetic, including the President of the United States, folks. In fact, he brought on this guy whose name was Morris Cook, and he wrote the original legal argument for universal electricity. In the docket was called "You Can Read This Memo in 12 Minutes," and it laid out literally for 12 minutes why we need to bring electricity to rural America. Now, we can also talk about the fact that there was a lot of politics involved in this. There was a lot of language like, we're going to modernize the housewife, right? Or so, there was some problematic language here. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to be a total evangelist here. But I think that having this mixture between this grassroots and top-down approach where they could actually meet at the local level ended up being quite successful.
Chris, that's super interesting. I just wanted to make sure you answered that question about broadband today.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were making the analogy. So you're saying who's making the... I know,
I'm an electricity person.
Yeah,
I'm sure that's why. But I am interested in today, to the extent there have been effective advocates. Are they the official people, like the state
They're
broadband
everywhere.
people? Oh, okay, they're everywhere.
They're everywhere and everyone.
Okay.
I mean,
Okay.
from just folks to school kids to county administrators to digital champions to federal folks, right? I mean, of all the evils wrought by the pandemic, I mean, one thing it did is we got on the same page, most of us, that broadband is not a luxury. It is a utility, is a need, is a necessity. Now we're going to argue politically about the details of this, but in the words of, I don't know, we all kind of came to the yard when it came to broadband during the pandemic. I was trying to quote the Milkshake song here. But I'm amongst friends, right? So
absolutely, that's the point of our book club. You can drop any type of lyric quote you want.
Thank you.
So we did see Michelle drop something in the chat, and then I'll move it over to Corianne.
Yeah, let me take.
Michelle posted that Pima County, Arizona is 9,100 square miles in size. The urban center surrounds the city of Tucson, and more than 1/3 of the county is a tribal nation. Michelle recognized that they just got your book in the mail. That's very exciting.
Thank you, Michelle.
They're only in the beginning chapters, but could you speak to a little bit about the policy, et cetera, as it relates to tribal nations in rural areas?
Yeah. Michelle, you bring up a great point, and also my major regret of the book, which is that it does not do justice to the marginalization of tribal communities. I will correct that with the next book, and I've been working hard to learn more about the dynamics of tribal broadband. Very much, our policy apparatus is very much, or in broadband, has very much replicated our other policies regarding to tribal nations, right? We disenfranchise them, we marginalize them, we ignore them. And then we dismiss them when it comes to things like tribal sovereignty. And so just as the private market has avoided rural and remote communities, it has entirely abandoned, not even abandoned, because it was never there in the first place, right? Tribal nations, often stating some stuff like, oh, it's just too hard, right? Or working through governance without doing the due respect. There is always, in the federal money, there were $3 billion for tribal broadband. My understanding is that $2 billion of this has already been spent. One of the things that I found really interesting, Ryan, I know you were there, but listening to Matt and Chris at the Tribal Broadband Boot Camp at the recent Net Inclusion Conference, was there was similarities between when we think about tribally built networks and municipal broadband networks. These are community-centered networks that are often faster, better, more trusted in these communities, right? And I think that's going to be really important. Now, you also bring up, Michelle, you brought up middle mile. This is one of the major issues facing our tribal communities is they might be able to put together this fabulous network, but there's a, what's the word, bottleneck, right, when it gets to reaching the wider internet because of a lack of middle mile in this country. California has been a trendsetter in this space, offering $5 billion specific for middle mile. I mean, the Infrastructure Act only offered $1 billion for middle mile. That is a drop in the hat. That's nothing, right? It went in a heartbeat. In fact, before I realized even the program existed, the money was gone. Not that they need to be talking to me, but it was just like this, just how fast these things move. So, one of the ways to empower tribal nations is to make sure that they have the middle mile to be able to work through their networks. The other thing that I think is really important, and this again was reinforced at Net Inclusion, is the importance of sovereignty, digital sovereignty, data sovereignty, right? As we are working towards respecting, hopefully, the policy is working towards respecting the sovereignty of our tribal nations. We need to, they need to be empowered to make the right digital decisions for themselves, and that is a concept known as digital sovereignty. And I think this is absolutely correct, and that means, for instance, being able to dictate where your traffic is flowing, right? Where your data is going, where is your data being housed, right? That's sovereignty, and we need to make sure that there is a policy apparatus in place that not only respects that but amplifies that. So far, it's just been a drop in the hat. Although, as Chris Mitchell certainly said, we're doing better than Canada. So, shame on Canada in this one regard. But yeah, Michelle, thank you so much for your question. And I think, keep asking this question every single time you go to a broadband event. And I would encourage us all to do that, right? If we're not talking about tribal broadband, ask a question about tribal broadband. These need to be in the same breath. Absolutely. So thank you, Michelle, for that. I appreciate it.
And hi, thank you. Sorry, I've put my hand down already. I do have a question though. So you talked a lot about the good policies of history, which I love. But just thinking about like what we can learn from history about what to avoid, especially like with regard to like tribal communities. I'm in Oklahoma and we see a lot where like as technology advances, people will come into a community, sort of build it up with technology and then leave all of the like waste behind in the community. I was wondering if you had seen any examples like from communities that had experienced that in other contexts that they were able to avoid it in broadband, or just like areas. I know that like data centers are a big thing right now, where it's like data centers are being built in rural communities. It's great because they're getting fiber, but like in 10 or 15 years, what are those communities going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Corinne. Thank you. And unfortunately, the book itself does not tackle the book. I say the book. I was more on the hunt for, I could see success stories. Certainly, what I'm learning now in terms of climate and responsible building, these data centers are absolutely toxic with the amount of energy. Especially, I've been reading a lot about what's going on in Texas, and these data centers are gobbling up as much power as a small town. The other thing where I think we can see an intersection where the book does touch on a little bit is Dig Once policies. Dig Once policies can be a way to really, be sensitive to climate disruption and earth disruption. And I would love to see us be thinking more about, well, if we're using all this infrastructure money to dig up a highway, let's make sure by law that a fiber conduit is going down that highway, right? Right now, like that, some states have it, but very, very, very few do. That's thinking through resilient climate networks, climate sensitive networks, right? That is absolutely something we should be thinking about. So that, that would be one. The other thing is, working through some redundancy. But I don't have a great answer to your question, aside to say that I think Dig Once would be a small drop in the bucket and a very easily attainable policy goal that would really help at least make us much more aware of the climate impact of these networks. Because, I think to the bigger point that you bring up, whenever we are being evangelists for anything, we have to acknowledge that there's always a dark side. I mean, for instance, one of the things that the internet does when we bring it to communities who are previously and underconnected is, we know it's all this great stuff, economic development and telehealth and education and public safety and civic engagement and quality of life, fabulous, fabulous, right? What does it also do? Well, there's a tremendous amount of concern for security. We are pushing people further into a capitalist system. We are, where it's more markers of surveillance, right? And I think that's actually something maybe the book could have done better, is say, I'm going to talk about the benefits of broadband, but we need to acknowledge these other components here. And that's something I'm trying to be much more sensitive to. And climate, to get to your question, is absolutely one of that I'm working on being more sensitive to in my writing.
Yeah, for all the good, there's always bad, but we appreciate that you're giving that perspective to us. Jim, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, Chris, I'd be interested in your perspective, and I think this was talked about a little bit at Net Inclusion on sustainability, right? Yeah, I mean, we are focused, rightfully so, on the BEAD programs and the digital equity programs, and probably all of the activity that will take place through the end of this decade. But I think everybody realizes that, technology evolves, it doesn't ossify. And you could say the same thing is true of many systems in society. The difference with technology is that it evolves at a breakneck speed, right? And what we think in terms of artificial intelligence today, we have no idea of the technology breakthroughs in the next decade or the decade after that. And, if you come, parents especially, but this is really true since I come from an Italian background, for immigrant families, many parents had this view that their kids stood on the shoulders of the parents, and the parents lifted them up, whether it be through education, through financial, through being the first member of their family to go to college, right? And so part of our leadership has to think about today, we are raising families with the ability, hopefully through the digital network, that their kids can stand on the shoulders of the parents and be something even greater in the next generation and the generation after that. And that's part, I think, of sustainability. Even after BEAD and digital equity, the Pennsylvania Broadband Authority allegedly sunsets 10 years after it was initiated, which would be early 2030s, right? And I've had discussions about that can't happen, and Pennsylvania needs to have a sustainability vision. And I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on that, or if you see that vision embraced in other states or maybe other countries.
That's a great question, Jim. Thank you. And of course, sustainability can take a lot of other directions. I mean, I will say that it boils my potatoes when I hear state leaders say that we're going to solve the digital divide in 5 years. It's not going to happen. And that's okay. It's not going to happen for the reasons you mentioned, Jim. I mean, education is a cradle to grave issue, right? There's always going to be new technologies. I teach this stuff, and I still feel so far behind. I've never done a TikTok, for instance, nor have I ever Snapchatted. But I also and I'm comfortable with digital technology. So we need to make sure, for instance, the digital equity inclusion place, it will never end. It will never end because and the other thing is, digital inclusion and equity is fundamentally tied to inequality, right? New technologies will always be rolled out to urban and wealthy areas first, right? The people who can afford it. This is why we always need to be thinking through access. We always need to be thinking about availability. We always need to think about literacy, because it's never actually going to end. We are laying the groundwork for what needs to be kind of a perpetual conversation around digital equity and inclusion that begins with universal connectivity. The other thing that I think, we tend to bypass when we think specifically about BEAD money, BEAD is CapEx, right? BEAD is CapEx. how are we going to afford to operate these networks once they're in place in rural areas that, as I previously said, does not have the consumer base to have merited a network, not merited, excuse me, to have a private investment in network in the first place? We need to be thinking about OpEx. We need to be thinking about a reformed universal service fund to make this happen. Because one of the other things that I'm increasingly worried about, now this wasn't in the book because the book didn't anticipate BEAD, but is, okay, so maybe some newcomers come up and they get some great BEAD money. They spend it in 5 years. They roll out these fiber networks. They realize there's no business case, and then they get gobbled up by incumbents, right? What type of mergers and acquisitions are we going to see? Are we just going to end up once again in this kind of oligopoly situation where we try to incentivize smaller providers and we didn't offer any support after the initial CapEx fund? And so, we need to be thinking about reformed universal service because we need to provide support. Let me back up for a second. Because we have placed broadband almost entirely under the auspices of the private market, we need to be thinking about support for that. Because if there was a business case to be made in Surrey County, Virginia, it would have been done. And so it's our responsibility, ours policymakers, lawmakers' responsibility to think through that. So OpEx is definitely one, literacy is definitely another. And the other thing, when I think about sustainability, going back to Corianne's question, I think about climate sustainability, right? How do we make sure that we are building redundant networks? What happens in another fire in Hawaii? What happens with another ice storm in Texas, right? Climate change is real. Climate change is happening. We're going to get extreme weather. How do we plan our networks to be able to be responsive to these weather conditions, right? That to me goes with sustainability as well. So I think all of these things need to be factored in, and I do worry that we're not taking this kind of long-term approach as we're kind of putting all of our proverbial hats and hopes and prayers and thoughts and dreams into BEAD and DEA. Let's think also beyond this. Let's use this as a foundation to build rather than just the ceiling to meet. I'm just preaching now, y'all. So, happy to.
No, I think everyone here, I think we all share in your sentiments and appreciate that you're willing to put those out there for us in some ways. I think one of the other questions that kind of has a policy side to it is that many in policymaking like to focus on the failures that municipalities have had when it comes to deploying broadband. However, many of the most unique broadband solutions have come from those types of communities. And I will give the shout outs to Ryan on this question for sure. In your book, you've highlighted so many of these communities and co-ops that have made it work for their residents, most prominently Rock County, Minnesota. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between focusing on the failures instead of the successes, when one would lead to objectively better deployment opportunities and outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. Comes down to trust in people, I think. My interviews that I've done, my field work, people trust their local providers, and that local provider can be a cooperative. It can be a municipality. Folks are willing. I mean, we saw this with RS Fiber in Minnesota. Folks are willing to bond themselves in order to support these types of build outs, right? We need to be able to empower them. Why don't we trust our communities to make the right decisions for them? That's, Rock County did the same thing. Rock County bonded itself $1 million a year from its wind turbine tax credits. Why not give every opportunity, every option to our communities and have them make the right choices for them? And absolutely that includes municipal networks. I mean, the fact that we can praise something like the Amon model or the Chattanooga model as some of the best broadband in the world, and I often find that those who advocate against municipal broadband, are picking out the same few examples, right? Some defaults, Bristol County or Bristol, Virginia ends up often being one, without doing any sort of due diligence on looking at the successes, right? Instead, a lot of it is, it's ideological. It's, well, municipal broadband distorts the quote unquote free market, right? Well, I'm sorry, if there was a market there to begin with, if we have all faith in the market would have solved this. So to me, it's about community empowerment. It's about community trust, right? And from all of my research, there is a power in being able to see your ISP in the grocery store or at church or at school and be like, hey, what's going on, right? There's a trusted relationship there. And certainly I learned that, the value of that when I was in Rock County, because, you know, they had this money and they went to a neighboring town, which happened to be in South Dakota, and talked so much about trust. They're our neighbors. We trust them. We trust them with our money, right? I'd love to see that trust reflected everywhere throughout the country. And I fundamentally believe that trust is a locally based trust. So let's trust our communities, you know, rather than telling them that certain options are on and off the table. And yeah, so that would be mine. It comes down to community trust.
Right. And I think also a point that you mentioned is accountability with that as well.
Absolutely. Accountability. Again, the grocery store, don't discount seeing someone at the grocery store, right? And being like, hey, I haven't had the internet for 2 days. Or, hey, I hear you know, you just connected my street. When are you connecting, or my neighbor's street? When are you connecting my street, right? Versus, you know, the phone calls from hell that we've all heard about. Trust, you're right. Trust and accountability is a better way to do it. Yeah. You know, one of the things that I'm so bullish about cooperatives is their willingness to take a much longer return on investment, 10, 20 years sometimes, because they see it as an investment in their communities. Now they see the business case for it too. I get that. I'm not naive, right? But they're willing to take that longer return on investment because of the community benefits.
Please, Kat, go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, Chris. So great to hear
Kat.
more about your book. My question for you is, you've talked a little bit today and in your book about how some of the historic funding that you've talked about has really gone towards the large incumbent providers. So looking towards BEAD now, of course, you know, we know that BEAD's relatively crystallized both in the legislation that enabled it and in many of the state plans that have already come forward. I'm curious your thoughts on any levers that local governments or states at this stage in the process can think about pulling to kind of not follow that same path and enable smaller ISPs and local ISPs to secure some of the funding.
Oh, that is a great question, especially because you're right. The proverbial cat is already out of the bag. So I wish a lot of this was handled in advance. For instance, you know, something that states can do is like, what does their application process actually look like? How do we make it easier for every type of applicant to be able to take advantage of? The other thing is, you know, there is a clause within the IIJA and of course within the NOFO around that you can't discriminate against municipalities, cooperatives, nonprofits, et cetera, right? That's in there. That's in the law. Now, of course, the original drafts all said we should privilege these entities. Now, it doesn't say privilege anymore. It just says they have to be eligible entities. We need to make sure that those laws are being upheld, and that these applicants who are local, often nonprofit alternatives, you know, are at the table. Now, but the frustrating thing here, I think, Kat, is that so much of the onus of this accountability work is being placed on local communities and on members of the public and on great organizations like Next Century Cities, right? We offloaded so much responsibility rather than, you know, place it with, you know, for instance, NTA or FCC in this regard, or even Congress. And like, I don't love that. I don't love the amount of labor, you know, I don't love with the mapping process that we needed folks to justify that they lived in where they lived with, like, yes, I promise I live here. There is a building here and this is my home, right? Someone shouldn't have to do that. And yet that's one of my concerns with BEAD is how hard we're making communities work to even get this money. So I think states will have a really important role here to be able to translate what is coming down from the federal level, what is coming down to the NTIA, to make sure that everyone can take advantage of these opportunities. And it is not about dumbing it down. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's translation. Policy is not written for communities, right? It is written to exclude communities. And so state broadband offices can play a huge role in just in translating. And I think that could go a long way as well. And the other thing is, and this is what I hate to say, is that we need to make sure that our local communities are empowered and knowledgeable about things like challenge processes, so that they have a voice at the table. That's going to be absolutely essential. And then, you know, we need to make sure that all of us are doing our due diligence around looking at who's applying and who's winning money, and the areas and the promises. You know, I'm going to give the FCC a hot second of credit here, but I was really glad when they finally got some accountability and pulled back on LTD and Starlink with RDOF. I mean, RDOF was a colossal disaster, but you know, at least we started to see some accountability there. And you know, I think it's on a lot of us to make sure that our communities have these voices at the table and have a shot. So it's going to be kind of an epic conversation between states and communities in the next few years. Not a great answer, I know, but it's gonna be an all hands on deck situation to make sure this money is efficiently spent, democratically spent, and socially justly spent. I don't think justly is a word. Socially just spent.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, I'll jump back in because I know you literally just touched on this kind of without saying it, but because in the book you kind of highlight the 4 M's of miserable network deployment. I was looking for a more alliterative way of saying that. I just couldn't find one.
Yeah.
But to my mind, looking at kind of the mapping and the meanings are the 2 largest culprits in this space. And that's one of the things that I wanted to gush a little bit about your book, is you put a glossary in the front of it, which is
thank you.
something that we don't ever see, and that we even had to fight the broadband nutrition label to get them to explain this is what the things that you're about to, like, we're going to tell you all of these things, but we wouldn't necessarily tell you what they mean if you didn't already know. So thank you for doing that. That makes life so much easier for some people. But the question is really, like, in your mind, is that mapping and meanings bit like the 2 biggest bits, or do you think that the other management and money displace those as like the top 2?
Oh, that's a great question.
Like how would you rank those 4 things in terms of probably
okay, probably mapping first. Like, I'm on the record. Okay. I reserve the right to change my mind, for the record. But on the spot, I mean, mapping is absolutely crucial. Correct maps are absolutely crucial to understand who is served, who is unserved, right? And again, maps that don't require licensing, and if they're using public money, they should be publicly available. I'll just throw that out there. You know, money, I think the money thing is interesting. We have spent a colossal amount of money, tens of billions of dollars, right? So I actually don't think it's about the amount of money that we've spent. So I actually don't. So probably you're right. Probably mapping and meaning, in terms of coming up with a definition of broadband that anticipates future usage rather than what we used yesterday, is going to be essential. You know, in the book, I advocated for 100-100. I said this to the Senate. Even Chair Rosenworcel at one point said 100-100 is table stakes. That number is going to change, right? So how do we keep ahead of the trend? And this is obviously a problem with policy in general, is keeping ahead of the trend of technology. But I don't want to discount management. One of the things that I found while researching my book is the amount of tension at the federal level between the FCC, USDA, and NTIA. There was a memorandum of understanding from a decade ago that I actually had to FOIA because no one wanted to talk to me about it, that mandated cooperation between FCC and USDA. We haven't really seen that. I mean, just even the fact that the FCC released RDOF at the exact same time we had BEAD suggests a massive issue of coordination communication, speaking to the fact that we don't have a national broadband plan, right? And when we did have a national broadband plan, like, we didn't do any check marks. It was brutal. So the fact that we're doing all of this without any sort of plan or any sort of coordination, I think, is deeply problematic. And it's funny, one of the reviews of my book said that I spent too much time talking about management and that federal agencies aren't a big deal. I'm going to push back on that here and say, like, no, they're a huge deal. The reason why NTIA got all this money is because the FCC didn't handle the money in the first place really well, right? So we need, and we can. What had the Interagency Coordination Act? Was that the 2021 Consolidated Appropriations Act? Maybe had the Interagency Act. I'm still not seeing a whole lot of coordination. Now I'm not in the room, but there are 3 chefs in this kitchen controlling billions of dollars. We need a plan. We need a plan. We need a leader, and I'm not seeing either of those things happen right now. And to repeat a phrase, it boils my potatoes.
I personally love that phrase, so I'm happy to steal that. We are kind of coming up on the last couple of minutes, and I'm gonna repost in the chat what Corianne did about a way that our viewers and our attendees can purchase your book if they have not already. I also, wanted to give you last couple of thoughts, maybe talking about what you have coming up next and what you want us to look out for. And while you do that, I'm also going to just post in here about our 10-year anniversary event by Bipartisan Tech for Next Century Cities, and invite you to register and join us in Washington, D.C., April 16th and 17th. Ooh. But I really want to allow Chris to give us his last couple of thoughts. And we really just appreciate so much you being here with us today, and all of your insights and all of the research and the hands-on work that you and Tuna did to really get us to this point.
Oh, thank you. Well, again, thank you so much. Thank you, Stacey, Ryan, and Corianne and Brittany Ray for this amazing invitation, this opportunity. Thank you, all of you, for coming. I want to be very respectful of everyone's time, so I've got 35 seconds. I'm starting a new book where Farm Fresh Broadband left off. Farm Fresh Broadband left off saying that broadband is about people. I'm working on a book that is entirely about how community stories can lead to equitable, socially just, inclusive telecommunications policy. Right now, the book is tentatively titled People Points, Putting the Public in Public Policy, One Story at a Time. And I'm spending the next few years listening. I feel like I've talked a lot. I mean, this is a great opportunity to talk, but I want to listen. It's time to listen again. And so I've been in Chester County with Jim. I've been listening to focus groups in there and in Virginia. I'm doing ride-alongs with cyber buses. I'm talking to first responders. I'm talking to everyone. Stories are so impactful. Stories are so important, and stories are data, right? And this is something I just want to tell every person I meet at the federal policy level that, you can keep your econometrics. I'm going to tell you a story about a second shift family. And that's what this book is going to be about. That's what this project is going to be about. So that's going to be, I would say, kind of my mission for the next few years is to listen to stories of connectivity.
We love that. And it couldn't be a better timing for our event, because it is about writing our next chapter together in broadband and highlighting storytelling. So it's definitely not a coincidence that we're all kind of seeing the importance of that and the fact that it really does push the needle. So thank you again so much for your time. Thank you to our audience members for having this be a collaborative and an enjoyable session for our first session of the series. We look forward to you all coming again. We're going to do this quarterly, so in a couple of months, where we highlight another author who's doing great, incredible work. But thank you again to Chris Ali, all the work that you've done for Farm Fresh Broadband for just deployment and access in rural communities.
Thank you so much. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.